Hello, Laverne here, and thank you for joining me. May this video be a blessing to you, and may it honor and glorify God in His kingdom. This video is a follow-up to my recent video in which I discussed the number of earthquakes. And I explained in my video that we actually have seen an increase in the number of earthquakes, and that this is a sign of the end times as prophesied about in Scripture. Now, I made my video as a response to one posted by the atheist Potholer 54, and in his video he stated that he was ridiculing and making fun of Christians who made this claim. For according to him, there hasn't been an increase in earthquakes, but in actuality there's been a decrease. Well, I'm going to use the same sites that he used for his information, and I'm going to demonstrate. I'm going to show that without doubt, without question, that there has been an increase, at least in regards to the larger earthquakes, those earthquakes that cause a lot of property damage and take many lives. The worst earthquakes, mega earthquakes, these are the ones that we are concerned with, and these are the ones that are on an increase. And there is no doubt whatsoever about this. It is irrefutable. Now, in my last video, I brought up the fact of the number of deaths. And what I did is I broke the last 110 years of where we have this information, and I broke it down to the first 50 years of the 20th century. And I explained that there were 875,424 deaths attributed to earthquakes. In the second half of the 20th century, the following 50 years, there were only 643,407 deaths. But then I went on to explain that in the 21st century, the last 11 years, we have experienced 696,535 deaths. This means then that in the last 11 years, we have seen more deaths attributed to earthquakes than the previous 50 years. And that this shows an increase in the intensity and the number of earthquakes. Well, many people, mostly atheists, commented that this is not the case, that the number of deaths are not a sign of anything. We can't say that this means there's been more earthquakes. Well, the fact is, when we look at the stats, this is the case. When we look at the number of the strong earthquakes in the last 11 years of the 21st century, we will see that there has been an increase in the earthquakes, and this is why we've seen so many deaths. I commented in my last video that when we look at the fact that we have better technology, better warning systems, we have buildings that are earthquake resistant, that we've seen such improvements in the last 50 years that we should be seeing a decrease in the number of deaths. Now, I'm going to look at the last 20 years, the last 2 decades. I'm going to look at the last decade of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century and compare them. From 1990 to 1999, when we look at the number of earthquakes that were 8.0 or greater, what we see is that there were 6. And then when we look at 2000 to 2009, what we see is that there were 13. So, the first decade of the 21st century has seen more than double the number of 8.0 earthquakes or greater than the last decade of the 20th century. This is significant. This is why Christians say we are seeing an increase in the number of earthquakes. Well, I know there's going to be atheists say, well, you just can't do that. You can't look at a 20-year block period. You can't just look at the last 20 years. It's not right. It's not fair. Well, okay. Let's go further back then. Still looking at earthquakes with an 8.0 or greater rating. And I'm going to break the last 110 years down into 2 blocks. I'm going to look at the first 55 years and then the second 55 years. What we find is that from 1900 to 1955, there were 44 earthquakes that exceeded or were 8.0 or greater. From 1956 to date, there were 43. So this shows that it's actually being fairly steady. That's what it looks like. But according to the US Geological Survey, they tell us that there's actually been a decrease in the number of earthquakes. Well, not when you look at 8.0 or greater. There's certainly been no decrease. Now they also say, the US Geological Survey, they state that on average we experience an earthquake of 8.0 or greater, one every year. But this is not the case. There have only been 87 of these earthquakes over the last 110 years. This means that we only experience on average an 8.0 or greater earthquake every 15 months. That's the way it's been for the last 110 years. But now, we're going to actually start looking at when these have occurred. From 2004 to 2010, there were 11 earthquakes of 8.0 or more. And you say, well, big deal, what's that mean? Well, this is a 7-year consecutive stretch. 7 consecutive years where we see a double-digit number for the number of earthquakes, reaching 11. This is significant because if you go back over the last 110 years and you look for other blocks of consecutive years reaching 7. So we're looking for 7 consecutive years and looking at the number of earthquakes in that block of time. What you will find is that none have exceeded that of 9 earthquakes. This is because of the average earthquakes only occurring every 15 months of this magnitude. And so when we look at an average of 7 consecutive years, we will see that on 4 occasions that they reached 9. 4 different times we can find a stretch of 7 consecutive years where they reached a magnitude of 8 or 0 of 8.0 or greater. This is significant because for the first time in the past 110 years, the last 7 years have seen us reach the double-digit numbers for earthquakes of an 8.0 or greater magnitude. For the first time. This shows that there has been, without doubt, without question, an increase in the number of these large earthquakes. This is why we have experienced 696,535 deaths in the last 11 years. Just to really try and drive this point home. This means that the last 7 years account for only 6% of the 110 years that we are looking at. 6%. But it accounts for 12.5% of the earthquakes with a magnitude of 8.0 or more. So the last 6% of the 110 years that we are looking at account for 12.5% of these large earthquakes, showing clearly that there is an increase in these earthquakes. Looking at the last 110 years again, but now looking at earthquakes that are 8.5 or more. And what we see is that over the last 110 years, there were only 16 of them. This means that when we're looking at the 87 that I just mentioned of 8.0 or more, it means that 71 of them were actually in the range of 8.0 to 8.4. So once we hit 8.5, there's a significant drop in the number of these earthquakes. 8.5 seems to be this dividing point. And what we see is that over the 110 years, there's only been 16 of these mega earthquakes. And of these 16, 6 of them occurred in the first 55 years of the last 110 years. That means 10 of them occurred in the last 55 years. So the first 55 years seen 6, the last 55 years seen 10. Again, showing an increase of these large earthquakes. In fact, more than a 50% increase of these large earthquakes. But what's even more significant is when we look at, we break down these 10 earthquakes in the last 55 years. For what we see is that 5 of them occurred in the last 7.5 years. 5 of them. So 5 out of the 16 have occurred in the last 6% of the years that we are looking at. So the last 6% of the 110 years has seen 31% of these large earthquakes. This is a significant increase. And it's not going to do you any good to stick your head in the sand like an ostrich and try to ignore these facts. These large earthquakes have increased. It's irrefutable. Now I'd like to actually just look at the just looking at the 10 largest earthquakes of the last 110 years. So we've gone from looking at earthquakes with 8.0 strength and more to looking at 8.5 and more, and now I'm just going to look at the 10 strongest earthquakes of the last 110 years. Well, what we find is that only 2 of them occurred in the first 55 years. 2. Leaving 8 having occurred in the last 55 years. Again, a clear indication that these large earthquakes have increased. But just as I've mentioned, all along, we find that most of them have occurred in the last 7.5 years. 4 of the 8 earthquakes that occurred in the last 55 years took place in the last 7.5 years. This is why we have seen the 600,000 plus, almost 700,000 deaths. It is because 4 of the 10 largest earthquakes in the last 110 years have occurred in the last 7.5 years. That is why. And it clearly shows an increase in these earthquakes. So it's not the Christian's imagination. It is not the imagination of people on YouTube trying to warn others that this is a sign of the times, that we are in the end days. There clearly is an increase in these large earthquakes, and it is these large earthquakes that are of concern. These are the ones that are taking lives and causing the damage. These are the earthquakes that have been warned about in Scripture. So, if you disagree, I would ask you to show me where I'm wrong. I'm going to provide the sites where I'm getting this information, and you can check this all out yourself. I don't believe I've made any mistakes, but you never know. Maybe I have. Show me how there hasn't been an increase in these large earthquakes. Show me how Christians are wrong. For I don't believe it's the case. I think it's very clear that when we look at the last 110 years and we look at the last decade, there's been a huge increase in the number of these earthquakes. All right, as always, I look forward to comments and messages. Till next time, peace and blessings.